The time has come for you to start implementing everything we've learned so far. I sure hope you remember all of it, right? Do you? Well, even if you don't, we'll be reviewing some of it here, and you can always go back and watch things over and over again. And I will never know. So I'm just gonna sit here and pretend and think that you clearly memorized everything the moment that you heard it. Clearly. So far, during our composition module, we've been dividing the screen on a 2D basis, where we just take the canvas and we make some lines dividing it. But now let's discuss what is actually getting divided, the stuff inside the canvas. And to be quite honest, it's usually just these three items: foreground, midground, and background. So here's foreground, here's the midground, and then here is the background. Sometimes it's just foreground and background with no midground because the image is more simple. Basically, think of it as cascading mountains. With each layer of mountain, it gets more distant, and it gets more atmospheric and more faded looking. Now, when you look at these mountains, you could argue and you could say, well, there's like 6 layers of the mountains, so we must have names like semi-midground or demi-midground or first, second, background for each of these. To which I would respond, no, we're going to simplify it to just 3: foreground, midground, and background. It's kind of like the 3 colors: foreground, midground, background. In fact, it's the exact 3 colors that we use in the previous black and white assignment in our first episode. It's almost as if they're all connected. What? What a crazy concept! In case you couldn't tell, yes, I was being sarcastic. But again, just like in black and white, you want to simplify the image. Because now you're going to add a layer of complexity because you want to divide the piece by its values. Do you remember when in that ball example in the very first episode where by changing the value, I could bring it closer or make it further behind? Well, now we're going to be applying that principle here. In order to make your piece feel full, you usually want a foreground, a midground, and a background. You can put your focus on any of these layers, but more typically you'll see people put their focus on the midground. So you can see the Pegasus here is on the midground. That's my focus. Now the other case is if you have only 2 layers, background and foreground, this can occur a lot too, and you would typically just put your focal into the foreground, as I did here. As a general rule of thumb, when you're painting, the foreground is typically darker, and then the midground is lighter and the background is lightest. This is because this is exactly what we see in nature most of the time, and is most applicable to environment-heavy pieces involving natural light. When you look at mountains, you know that the mountain closest to you is typically the darkest one, and then they slowly fade into the background is the lightest. This applies whether it's a room or a jungle, the darkest is typically in the front. And another rule of thumb, the closer value that 2 items are, then the closer these 2 objects are physically. For example, if I were to take these mountains and make them darker, then they feel that they're much closer to the front mountain, so my midground looks closer to the foreground than they do to the background. But let's say that I turn these mountains super pale, then suddenly the foreground mountains look very close to me, and the midground mountains look very far away. It's a very simple concept, but as soon as you can wield this properly in your paintings will give the same wow effect as if someone just saw the beautiful Himalayas themselves in person. This doesn't always have to be the case though. Sometimes the foreground is light and the background is dark. You will see this most often at night. Let's say that you have a fire in the scene. Then typically you'll have a dark foreground, a super bright midground, and then again a dark background. Essentially, the only time that you won't see a natural progression of dark foreground to medium, midground, and very light background is if there is some kind of light source that is adding new light to the scene. Otherwise, you really can't go wrong with this formula. I would even argue lots of times people don't follow it enough. People are scared of losing detail in the piece, so they make everything roughly the same value. Therefore, their pieces will end up looking something more towards like this. Like, I can't really tell what's going on anymore in this piece. But it's a common mistake that I see everywhere. You get the same problem, essentially, that you had in Strange Magic versus Up, where the image is messy because there was no foreground to background understanding. You need to lose detail in order to become more clear. You need a clear distinction. In fact, I can actually tell you just how distinct you need to be. Let's take a look at these mountains, for example. I know, mountains everywhere. And we split a value chart from 0 to 100. So 0 being the darkest and 100 being the lightest. You want to group your values like so. Dark, medium, light. By using the value chart, we can numerify just how dark and light it is. The very foreground is between a 0 to 10 range. The midground is between a 40 to 60 range, and then the background is between a 90 to 100 range. Notice how there is a good 30 to 40 numerical gap. I write 20 to 30, but I do mean 30 to 40. There's a distinct gap between these values. This is the most solid way to make sure that you have a very distinct foreground, midground, and background. Most people who start off painting go too light on their values, so everything begins to clash altogether. But by separating these well, you can create a beautiful amount of depth and make your concept piece absolutely immersive, because after all, that is our goal. So the next time you're double checking your work in black and white, check to see if your values are distinct enough from each other in midground, foreground, and background. And please, please, please don't do this. Don't look at it and say, oh, this is darker than this one. Oh, but this one's lighter than this one. Don't worry about that. Just look at the bigger picture. Look for groups of value, giant blocks of value. Ask yourself, if I only had 3 values, black, white, gray, which ones would I group into which? This is why we did black and white first, because it's the foundation, the core, and it drives all of this picture making. This foreground, midground, background stuff is honestly secret sauce that makes your painting feel like it's immersive, as if someone could reach their hand and say that they can be there, because having these layers gives your piece a 3D-like effect. Before I start sounding like a broken record, let me actually start by creating a piece. To make sure that I don't kill you by making this specific video longer than 20 minutes, I'll catch you in the next video.